Good morning, everybody. It's my distinct honor to inaugurate this conference by thanking you all for being here, by thanking especially the speakers who have come far and wide to join in this Congress, by thanking the audience, of course. Thank you for coming, so many, on this lovely December day. And by thanking all of those who made this conference possible. It's been long in the making, and we've accrued many debts, many of which I can't, all of which I can't acknowledge explicitly, but some of thanks. Mr. Rona Yirjalu, Mr. Wajih Bizri, Mr. Mehmet Habab, Mr. Tevfik Öz, the Sezai Turkish Feyzi Akkaya Construction Company, the TML Inşaat Company, the Turkish Petroleum International Company, all were very generous funders of this event, and we thank them. I want to also thank the Yunus Emre Institute and Mr. Cengiz Erolu in particular for making it possible. I want to thank the Turkish Embassy in Beirut and the Turkish Ambassador to Beirut personally for making it possible, for their funding and their support. I thank the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at the American University of Beirut, and I want to thank personally Dean Nadia Sheikh for her stalwart support and constant encouragement. I want to thank the Department of History and Archaeology as a whole for their support, but especially I'd like to thank my colleague and friend, Professor John Malloy, for his constant encouragement and support, despite his obvious Mamlukist inclinations. Finally, and most warmly, I would like to support Ms. Rita Basil, without which really none of this would have happened. Mr. Makram Rabah, soon to be, inshallah, Dr. Makram Rabah, without which none of this would have been possible. And finally, on a personal, but also I'm sure collective note, I would like to thank Professor Engin Akarlı, our guest of honor today and in the next few days, for his presence here. His importance to the field needs no repetition, but to me, he holds a special place because he was my first, in a way, my first introduction to Ottoman history. When as a youthful child, I would visit my sister who studied at Brown University, where Professor Akarlı was a guru of sorts. So thank you all for coming. I wish you all a pleasant conference, and I would like to call to the table first of all, Dr. Fadl Khouri, President of the American University of Beirut, His Excellency Chagatai Erciyes, Ambassador of Turkey to Lebanon, and Professor Abdurrahim Abu Hussein, my co-conspirator on this, and Professor of History at the American University of Beirut. Thank you all.
Good morning. First of all, this is one of our last, I think, 2 or 3 major academic symposia of a remarkable 150th year. I want to congratulate Drs. Abdulrahim Abu Hussein and Alexis Wick for this magnificent conference. I'd like to welcome all of our ancestors of the Mamluks and the descendants of the Mamalik. The ancestors are somewhere in the air, and the ancestors and the descendants of the Ottomans. I think this is a year that you grow up, whether you grew up in the Arab world or in Turkey, knowing very well the significance of. I think this should spark some really closer collaborations between AUB and some of the leading Arab universities and the top Turkish institutions of higher learning. This is way overdue based on mutual interests, and I know the ambassador's been working very hard to make that happen, so we need to help him a little bit. Of course, AUB has a long history of relationship with Turkey. First of all, AUB was founded as the Syrian Protestant College at about the same time as Roberts College, 2 missionary schools with initially very similar purposes. The Roberts College, the first building, was rented from the Board of Commissions for Foreign Missions, the same body that founded the Syrian Protestant College in 1863. The school that I and Dean al-Sheikh attended, the International College, was actually initially founded in Izmir, or Smyrna, in 1891 as the American Boys' School, before it moved to Beirut to become the AUB Prep School in 1931. And AUB, which was founded during Ottoman times, has been in continuous operation carrying out its mission of educating the youth of the region since it opened its doors for the first class in 1866. A couple of days ago, we were treated to Professor Abu Hussein's very interesting perspective on Jamal Pasha. Many of us grew up knowing that Jamal Pasha more or less turned a blind eye to AUB's efforts to protect the French missionaries because he had high regard for Howard Bliss and for the mission of the university. And actually, AUB received the commendation of the Ottoman government during World War I for its relief efforts. In the heyday of Beirut and of AUB, we had a fairly large contingent of Turkish students, many of whom went on to have very distinguished careers, including Hacettepe, the founder of Hacettepe University, Dr. Dogramici. So there is a long and distinguished history. The era itself of 1516 really was the very end of the Arab hegemony and the clear rise of the Ottoman Empire. Following 1492 and the exit from Europe, 1516 really marked the end of Arab cultural and military dominance and ushered in the era of Ottoman dominance. So one culture replaced another, absorbing much of its strengths and certainly no small number of its challenges. But I'm looking forward to hearing as much as I can in the next couple of days as I flit in and out between this and other meetings. I hope most of the rest of you can stay and are not constrained to be perpetual butterflies on the walls. This really is a remarkable program. Reading what these 2 tireless individuals have put together, it's an incredible symposium with some of the key scholars from AUB and from major Turkish and international universities, including the United States, of the impact of Mejdabek 500 years later, of the history, of the culture, and really, I think this is an extraordinary symposium. I hope that you'll be capturing some of it for posterity so that you put it in a time capsule, maybe 500 years from now, people will see what you did. So thank you and welcome. Thank you, Ambassador.
Ambassador.
I think the
Buyurun.
ambassador has the floor.
Buyurun.
Thank you, President Kuri, dear Professor Abu Hussein, dear. You hear me? Dear President Kuri, dear Professor Abu Hussein, dear friend, Pakistani ambassador, dear Minister Diab, distinguished professors, dear students, friends, it's a great pleasure and honor for me to address such a distinguished group of guests at the opening of this important and timely conference entitled 1516, the year that changed the Middle East and the world. I must admit that as a Turkish ambassador, every event that I attended so far in AUB was a rewarding experience for me. And today's conference is no exception, and indeed it is for me the most exciting and inspirational one because of the high profile and the variety of the participants and its subject matter. I would like to add my voice to you, Mr. President, in warmly welcoming all 33 professors from 9 different countries who are contributing this conference. We are delighted to see you in Lebanon. This conference would not have been possible without the invaluable support and contribution of a number of individuals and institutions. First, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to AUB for hosting this conference and President Kuri for his patronage and blessing. And I rest assure you that Turkey would continue to support AUB, and we look forward to organizing more events like the one we are having today. Likewise, allow me to also thank Professor Abdul Rahim Abu Hussein for his tireless efforts in organizing this conference. He was indeed the mastermind behind the whole idea. My personal appreciation also goes out to Mr. Mehmet Ali Neyzi. Where are you? An AUB postgraduate student, yet a close friend and a former businessman. I'd like to thank him for his energetic efforts in bringing us together through his organizational and fundraising skills. I thank you, Mehmet Ali. Likewise, I would also like to thank the director of Yunus Emre Turkish Cultural Center, Mr. Cengiz Eroğlu, for working continuously to make this conference a success. Last but not least, I would like to acknowledge the generous support of our sponsors, namely the Foreign Economic Relations Board of Turkey, Turkish Lebanese Business Council, Yunus Emre Turkish Cultural Center, and TİKA. I recognize the presence of their representatives, including Mr. Rona Yircalı and Mr. Waji Bizri, who are among us today. Thank you for your kind support. We are most grateful to that. As for the subject matter of our conference, I would not dare to get into details in front of so many distinguished history professors. In my humble opinion, history should be left to the historians rather than diplomats and politicians, and be written based on facts and documents rather than ideologies. With that reservation, allow me to say a few words about the conference topic. As you all know, this year marks the 500th anniversary of the Battle of Marjadabek that took place between the Ottoman Empire and the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt in the north of Aleppo. This battle was a turning point in the history of the Middle East. For sure, this battle permanently shaped the region's politics, demographics, and religious movements. Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine became a part of the Ottoman Empire after this battle. As such, it was the beginning of 400 years of peaceful coexistence among the people of the region. Unfortunately, the Middle East now does not resemble the peaceful coexistence of the previous era. The region today deeply suffers from violence, terrorism, religious fundamentalism, and sectarian policies. We are all witnessing what is happening in Syria in general and the tragedy in Aleppo in particular, where the very Battle of Marj Dabak took place 500 years ago. Aleppo today has become a stain on the conscience of humanity. In this respect, I sincerely hope that a political solution in Syria can be reached as soon as possible in line with Geneva Convention and the UN Security Council Resolution 2254, so that there will be no more human suffering. With these thoughts, I sincerely wish that this conference will bring a new perspective in understanding the history of our region in retrospect with your valuable intellectual and academic contribution. So I welcome you all once again, and I wish you a very fruitful and productive conference. Thank you.
Professor Abu Hussein, تفضل.
Good morning. Thanks have been delivered, but as we say, وبالشكر تدوم النعم. So I would like to add my thanks to the thanks that Ali had already delivered, and I would like to also acknowledge the presence of my dear friend and distinguished historian, Engin Akarlı, who is among us as the guest of honor of the conference. I'm going to talk about Arabs and Turks in a way. Historical circumstances have entwined the fortunes of the Arabs and the Turks, for better or for worse, for more than a millennium. It is not my intention today, in this brief discussion, to trace this association through time or to discuss its origins, but rather to try to understand the complexity of the relationship by looking at how the Turks have been perceived by the Arabs at certain stages of their relationship. Over time, the nature of this association has varied, not always according to the balance of power between them. They have been equal partners, subjects, rulers, and at times estranged brethren, bound by a common history, and most of them by faith too, yet divided by widely diverging interests, especially following the demise of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of the modern nation-states on its ruins. This has produced a state of estrangement or even hostility between Arabs and Turks, at least as the evidence in their respective historiographies show. Such hostility, which is the product of relatively recent times, reflected itself on earlier epochs, particularly the longest and the most intense in terms of human and cultural interaction, i.e. the Ottoman period. This is a period that has been, for the most part, vilified and described as a period of Turkish tyranny and unmitigated decline, or to a much lesser extent romanticized for different reasons, be they Islamic or relating to a presumed Ottoman multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilinguistic commonwealth. This last aspect is perhaps most poignant considering the current Arab predicament. As historians, let's go back to a reading of the sources for what they say at the time it was said, rather than reading them in the light of present political alignments and sentiments, as many historians do, both in the Arab world as well as in Turkey. I begin in 1291. This is the time when the Mamluk Sultan, we are giving credit to the Mamluks on account of our colleague John Milloy. 1516, of course, was the destruction of the Mamluk Sultanate, and here we are trying to revive it a bit. This is the time when the Mamluk Sultan Al-Ashraf Khalil had succeeded in bringing to an end the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem and evicting the last Crusaders from Bilad al-Sham. A Damascene poet, Shihab ad-Din Mahmud, sang his praises in a poem which begins, excuse the reference to As-Salib, but here what is meant is the kingdom of Jerusalem rather than Salib. I'll read the poetry first in Arabic, then I'll translate it. الحمد لله ذلت دولة الصلب وعز بالترك دين المصطفى العربي. In English, praise be to God, the state of crosses has been humiliated and the religion of Al-Mustafa, the Arab, has been fortified by the Turks. Midway through the rather long poem, Shihab ad-Din Mahmud says, جيش من الترك ترك الحرب عندهم عار وراحتهم ضرب من الضرب. In translation, an army of Turks for whom abandoning war is a disgrace and to whom rest is a form of sickness. The sentiments expressed in this poem would perhaps reflect the way many Arabs in Bilad al-Sham must have felt about the preeminent Turks of the time, the Mamluks. Their success in ousting the Frankish squatters from the Holy Land and their earlier repelling of the devastating Mongol invaders in 1260 must have represented a glimmer of hope amid the bickering and political divisions that had riven the area for a long time, or at least an opportunity for a poet in need of a courtly patron. Moving ahead 2 centuries to Marj Dabiq, the battle whose 500th anniversary we mark today with our conference, the Ottoman entry into the Arab world was met with less fanfare, but certainly little animosity. Sultan Salim I's triumphant entry into Aleppo following the Battle of Marj Dabiq is said to have been met by widespread cheering. Salim's reception there was that of a legitimate sovereign rather than a conquering commander, a status that was certainly aided by the swift and relatively bloodless submission of Syria to its new conqueror. Moving along with Salim's army as it proceeded to Damascus, the notable heads of city quarters, Mashaykh al-Harat, and its ulama met as an advance party representing the Ottomans approached and decided to surrender the city. The Ottoman party was met with tahleel and accompanied with a crier announcing aman, that is safety. And they proceeded from one quarter to another. The city was surrendered without any fighting and its gates were opened. On Friday, Sha'ban 22, that would be the year 1516, the sermon, the Umayyad Mosque, was delivered by Walawi ibn al-Farfur, the Hanafite Mufti, in the name of the King of Rome. The King of Rome is Salim, that is. This was the case in all mosques. Then the army started to come into the city. Some of the troops forcibly imposed themselves on people outside Damascus. The people came and complained to Yunus Pasha, the Ottoman appointed governor. The governor proceeded to arrest them, tied them in ropes, and had them executed. The rest of the troops detested from further impositions on the people of Damascus. But apart from these incidents, the mood of Damascus, and perhaps the Damascenes, is best captured by the eyewitness account of Ibn Tulun, the Damascene polymath, alim, and historian par excellence of the city in both late Mamluk and early Ottoman times. Before citing Ibn Tulun's account, a brief word of introduction is perhaps in order. He was born in Damascus in 1476 to Ali ibn Tulun and a Turkish mother called Özden. Some later Damascene historians of the 16th century suggested that he was a descendant of Ahmad ibn Tulun, the governor of Egypt in the 3rd Hijrah, 10th AD century. At any rate, his family name Dolan, suggests a Turkish descent. Perhaps more importantly, Ibn Tulun was perhaps the most accomplished scholar of his time, mastering and authoring books in as many as 38 disciplines, ranging from Hanafi jurisprudence to theology, history, geometry, astronomy, and social manners. Despite his erudition, Ibn Tulun never accepted any appointment to positions other than in teaching. I move now to Ibn Tulun's account of the entry of the Ottoman army into Damascus. Early on Sunday, the 1st of Ramadan, 922, that's again 1516, the king of Rome, Salim Khan ibn Bayezid Khan, and he goes on to list the fathers and grandfathers up to Osman or Uthman, the founder of the Ottoman state. So Salim arrived at the Mastaba adjacent to the upper Qabun. These are sort of suburbs of Damascus. He interjects here, this Uthman is one of the Mamluks of Ahmad ibn Tulun, the governor of Egypt. Such a claim, of course, would make Salim I and Ibn Tulun distant cousins. It is also said that he could be a Mamluk of Ma'mun. This is a genealogy that is most curious for the Ottoman dynasty, and Ibn Tulun may be the only one who made such a claim. Whatever the case, Ibn Tulun continues his account, and I quote now, Salim arrived in a great army, the like of which has never been seen by us, i.e. the Damascenes. It is said that it numbers 130,000 made up of Rum, Armenians, Tatars, cavalry, and Franks. The army is preceded by 30 carriages, 20 wheeled guns, each pulled by 2 mules. When they fired the guns, the Damascenes thought that the sky had fallen on earth. Behind these are people playing the flute and drums. Behind them is the infantry with muskets. Then comes the Hunkar. The Hunkar is the Sultan, the aforementioned king. Behind him came the standards, the toes, and soldiers according to rank. Ibn Tulun goes on to say, and I quote, on the second day of Ramadan, which is actually the second day of the arrival of Salim in Damascus, I went to the Otar, that is the imperial tent, with the intent of meeting with the ulama in his company, in the company of Salim, who are said to be 36 Hanafite ulama. But I was unable to do so because of my ignorance of their language. I toured the camp, فَدُرْتُ فِيهِ, and was astounded, the hiltu, by its size and variety, and wondered at the markets it contained, whereby there is hardly anything that is not available. And all this had come with him from his homeland. Thus, there are 15 people for frying meat, and the same number of cooks for a variety of foods, 15 physicians, 15 surgeons, 15 vets, 15 shoemakers, 15 blacksmiths, and he goes on to list other craftsmen. These are the approximate numbers, and I am inclined to think that it is more than these. In addition to other craftsmen, I then proceeded to the carriages and wheeled guns. I examined them. They are something I have never seen before. They are intriguing and indicate his might. The carriages are chained to each other so that when they are arranged next to each other, they form a wall. Each carriage fires a bullet, which is a handful. These bullets are stored in a box on the underside of the carriage. I then proceeded to the tent of the Hunkar, i.e. the Sultan Salim, but was not allowed to come close to it. But I could look at the drums. Each drum can only be carried by 2 men. Every 2 drums are loaded on a camel. His camp is on the same mastaba. Soldiers are at a stone throw away on each side, encircling the Hunkar's tent as a wall around the city. On Tuesday, the 6th of Ramadan, 922, the same year, 1516, the Hunkar came from the mastaba, excuse me. The Hunkar came from the mastaba to the Hamawi bathhouse in the Qasab mosque quarter. He gave the man who shaved him 500 dirhams, the same to the chief Hammamji. When he entered the bathhouse, he was seen with a trimmed beard. Trimmed beard is in fact maybe not the right translation. He was seen in Arabic, he was seen with the lihya latifa, which I suspect was the growth between Aleppo and Damascus. But trimmed beard was also suggested by my colleague, John Milloy. So he came into the hammam with a trimmed beard, but as he came out, the beard was shaved like most of his soldiers. Historians familiar with the work of Ibn Tulun agree that he cannot be reasonably described as pro-Ottoman. His account of the Ottoman entry into Damascus, however, tells us volumes about the way Damascenes felt about their new ruler and his army. Ibn Tulun makes it abundantly clear that he was greatly impressed with Ottoman might and wealth, and his tour of the Ottoman camp and coming to immediate vicinity of the imperial tent, his and other Damascenes observing Salim going to the bathhouse and going out of it from a distance that allowed them to notice his trimmed or small beard and the lack of it on exit are not likely diversions of people just occupied by an enemy force. Ibn Tulun does not pass judgment on Ottoman actions as Syria was being incorporated into the Ottoman domain. He simply relates what he saw. If he was not a direct witness, in certain cases, he cites his sources. This brings his testimony as close to reality as any historian hoped to get. Thank you. I have an announcement to make. We have arranged a small exhibition of Ottoman documents relating to AUB and to Beirut and Lebanon in general in the lobby of Jaffet Library, and you are all invited to go and have a look at the exhibition. Please, we don't have much time for this, but you will have an opportunity to go to it sometime later on, but we want you to go now and for 15 minutes maximum, because we need to come back to our first working session of the conference.
Thank you, Professor Hussein. Thank you, everyone. One last thing, as I shall abuse my position at the table to rectify an omission, and I second Professor Hussein in insisting on keeping time We have many papers, and the chairs have been instructed to be very severe with timekeeping. But the omission concerns the final thanks in my introductory ones, and clearly the most important thanks get forgotten most often. Please join me in thanking the great work and great efforts and great encouragement and great diligence of Mr. Mehmet Ali Nezi, without whom nothing would have happened. He brings great honor and great cheerfulness to our PhD program, where he is a doctoral candidate, and I cannot thank him enough for his contributions.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to chair this first panel of our conference, what promises to be a very interesting conference. My name is Dalia Jubara. I am an assistant professor in the Civilization Studies program here at AUB. I'm also a historian of Egypt in the 18th century, and it's a double pleasure for me to be chairing this panel aptly entitled The Lure of Cairo. I just returned from a trip to Cairo and was very pleasantly, let's say, surprised to see that despite everything that's going on, Cairo continues to beat ferociously against all odds. Its lure has not diminished one bit. It continues to enchant, in fact, ensnare anyone who has visited it, with its majestic, incomparable spaces, its wonderful people, and above all, for all of us who study it, it remains confounding and absolutely amazing. And with us today are two such victims of Cairo's allure. It's my pleasure to introduce them. Giancarlo Casale, who is Associate Professor of History of the Islamic World and Morse Alumni Distinguished Teaching Professor at the University of Minnesota. He is the author of The Ottoman Age of Exploration, published by Oxford in 2011, and is the executive editor of the Journal of Early Modern History. He's currently a Fernand Braudel Senior Research Fellow at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy, where he is hoping to complete a new book on intersections between intellectual life in the Ottoman Empire and the Italian Renaissance. Our first, but I'm introducing him second because the program slightly shifted, speaker will be Matthew Melvin Kushki. He's assistant professor of history at the University of South Carolina. He specializes in early modern Islamicate intellectual and cultural history with a focus on the theory and practice of the occult sciences, a subject that's very dear to my heart, in Timurid, Safavid Iran, and the broader Persianate world. Please help me welcome Matthew, who will speak first for around 30 minutes. Then Giancarlo will speak, and then we'll open the floor for questions.
Everybody hear me? All right? Is this also good? No. Let me raise it up slightly. Just lean down a little bit. All right. Thank you so much for having me here. I am not an anonymist, so I hope I don't ruffle too many feathers, but I am a Timuridist, and I do think that the Timurids and Ottomans really do need to be studied together much more than they have been. Again, thank you for having me today. So my title, Strange Attractor, is reference to magnetism in general, which is an occult force. So I'll be talking about the occult force that drew Salim to Cairo, specifically the occult scientific intellectual context. I have 4 theses today, and my apologies, I'm extremely jet lagged and extremely foggy at the moment, so yell if I'm not making any sense. But four theses today. In the combined wake of the transformative Mongol conquest of Western Asia, let's use this. Can you hear me now? I'll do that. All right, so I have four theses today. One, in the combined wake of the transformative Mongol conquest of Western Asia in the 13th century and the Black Death in the mid-14th, the Islamic heartlands were swept by an occultist renaissance. As seen to the sanctification and de-esotericization of lettrism in particular, and I'll explain what I mean by that, late Mamluk Cairo emerged as the occult scientific capital of the Islamic world by the turn of the 15th century, a magnet for Timurid, Aqayunu, and Ottoman intellectuals alike. Two, you have Salim's 1514 victory at Chaldiran, his 1516 conquest of Damascus, and his 1517 conquest of Cairo, together spurred the scholarly formation of a new Ottoman universalist imperial ideology, expressly lettrist in tenor. And again, I'll explain that. This as challenge to Timurid Aqayunu precedent in particular. That precedent was itself formulated precisely in Mamluk Cairo as hub of the new Brethren of Purity, the new Ikhwan al-Safa, an Arabophone, Persophone republic of letters active from Anatolia to India and heavily invested in the occult sciences and especially in the Neo-Pythagorean trend. Three, from the early 15th century onward, letter magic and letter divination were embraced by scholarly and ruling elites as key weapons in the contest for imperial supremacy within the early modern Turco-Mongol Perso-Islamic world, whether Ottoman Mamluk, Ottoman Safavid, or Mughal Safavid. These are part of a cultural continuum, rather. And these weapons were deployed rhetorically and militarily in equal measure. So war magic, we're talking about hardcore war magic as well as ideology formation. And four, early Ottoman imperial ideology and military strategy are hence both illegible absent their originary Mamluk, Timurid, Aqayunlu occult scientific context. So that's my basic thesis today. I don't have time to give you much evidence to support these theses, but we can certainly talk more in the Q&A period about that evidence. So what do I mean by occultism, occult science? The occult science is the ulum ghariba, or the khafiya or the ghamida, the hidden or secret or rare or difficult elite sciences, are almost always classified as such in classifications of the sciences. We're talking about astrology, alchemy, various forms of magic and divination, geomancy, etc. Lettrism will be the main science under review today, the ilm al-huruf, science of letters, which becomes in the late 14th, early 15th century, probably the most universal of the occult sciences, the most mainstream, certainly, as well. And this is a new thing in Islamic intellectual history as well as in political history, right? The explosion of lettrism in the late 14th, early 15th century Cairene context is the basis for Ottoman, Timurid, and Aqayunlu imperial ideology. So when I talk about lettrism, I'm talking about this umbrella term, basically encompassing letter magic on the one hand, so talismans, and letter divination on the other, Jaf, divination, prognosticons. Ottoman archives are full of these Jafrit, Jamit compilations, these comprehensive prognosticons. These are especially tied to the muqatta'ats, the mysterious surah initial letters in starting various Quranic surahs. And this is coming into prominence precisely at the same time that Hebrew Kabbalah is really exploding on the scene, especially in Islamic Spain in the 12th, 13th centuries. So that's lettrism. And of course, we all know the muqatta'at, Alif Lam Mim, for example, in Surah Al-Baqarah. These are used for political prognostication in the first place, right? From Ali onwards, they are used to predict political events, changes of dynasties, and so on and so forth, end of the world as well. So today I want to look at actually briefly contextualize two Ottoman lettrist texts. First is Abdurrahman Bastami's Miftah al-Jafar al-Jami'. As Cornel Fleischer has shown, this is really an text for Ottoman imperial ideology in the 16th century, especially under Suleiman. I'm proposing that we need to look at Salim's reign in particular to understand why lettrism, Bastamian lettrism in particular, becomes so crucial. to Ottoman imperial formation. And then secondly, the Surah Ibn Arabi, الشجرة النعمانية في الدولة العثمانية, a 15th to 16th century text that predicts the Ottoman conquest of Egypt in particular, right? So just a few brief looks. This is the Miftah Jafar Jami' of Bastami. Very, very popular text. This was produced en masse and including in small sort of vademecum editions. So Bastami was part of the what I call the New Brethren of Purity network, the Neo Ikhwan al-Safa, active in this area, basically between Cairo, Anatolia, and Western Iran, Fars, Shiraz in particular, and on to India in the turn of the 15th century. They call themselves the Ikhwan al-Safa in order to signal their project to revive the project of the original Ikhwan al-Safa, i.e. the Neo-Pythagorean and heavily occult scientific knowledge of the cosmos. And so this is a intellectual network. It's a republic of letters. These are some of the most influential people of the early 15th century. But unlike their predecessors, they are the primary imperial ideologues of the 15th century. And that is how you get to Ottoman occult scientific imperialism, quite deliberately. Bastami is one among many members of this network. The central node of this network is this guy, Akhlati, Sayyid Hussein Akhlati, a Kurd from Tabriz, a physician, an alchemist, and a letrist. He is invited to Cairo by Sultan Barquq. Barquq was a big fan of the occult sciences. He surrounded himself with occult scientists. Akhlati then becomes the central node in this Brethren of Purity network, again, fanning out from late 14th century Cairo. He dies in 1397, and his students include Bastami, Abdurrahman Bastami, and a number of other people I won't get into today. Out of that network comes the Shajara al-Nu'maniya. This is attributed to Ibn Arabi. Obviously, it's not by him, but it's certainly in line with his letrist proclivities. Ibn Arabi is the primary letrist authority for the Ikhwan al-Safa in the 15th century. You can see here, I won't get into the details. This is a Jafri prediction of the Ottoman conquest of Egypt. If you zoom in a little bit more, you can see Misr then in the middle, so the focus is on Egypt. And there is, among other things, this prediction, إذا انقضت قاف الجيم قامت ميم سليم في القرآن الكبير وتقابل الجيشان بخط النهروان يوفريتس واصطدم من عنصر الهواء حرفان الرابع غالب والخامس مغلوب. This is seen. These two air letters, seen in Qaf, represent Salim and Qansu al-Ghori, right? So Salim must win in Egypt against Qansu al-Ghori, or sorry, in Syria against Qansu al-Ghori. So this is a great support for Ottoman imperial ideology in the late 15th, early 16th century. To contextualize those two texts, I would like to look very briefly today at three Ottoman letrist imperial ideologues who are not usually received as such in the historiography. Kamal Pasha Zada Ahmed, Idris Bedlisi, and Mufti Ahmed Pasha. So first, before we get to, I'd like to go in reverse chronological order and begin with Cairo, 1517. I'm actually not going to talk about 1516, my apologies. I'll talk about 1514 and 1517. So toward Cairo, the occult attractor. So you have Salim, of course, and Qansu al-Ghori. Kamal Pasha Zada talks about the conquest of Egypt in a very short risala, a very short treatise, which is expressly letrist. He basically provides a letrist proof for Salim's fatedness as conqueror of Egypt, right, of Cairo. Kamal Pasha Zada, of course, is a very prominent individual. He's the chief mufti later on after the conquest of Egypt, Sheikh al-Islam in Istanbul, mainly because he accompanied Salim to Damascus and gave him considerable ideological support, especially urging him to conquer Cairo, again, through the vehicle of this short letrist treatise. This short treatise is not included in his larger tafsir, interestingly enough. And again, it's very short and to the point and is purely letrist, as I will show. It was briefly, very briefly analyzed and transcribed by Dr. Mustafa Kilic in 1990. But again, he doesn't provide any of the intellectual historical context at all. He certainly does not discuss the mainstream status of the occult sciences. So yeah, for the purposes of brevity, I will very quickly get to the meat of his arguments, which is an analysis of this verse, Surah Al-Anbiya 105, وَلَقَدْ كَتَبْنَا فِي الزَّبُورِ مِنْ بَعْدِ ذِكْرِ أَنَ الْأَرْضَ يَرِثُهَا عِبَادِ الصَّالِحُونَ. And the normal, should we say, literalist reading would be, or translation rather, for we have written in the Psalms after the remembrance, my righteous servants shall inherit the earth. So how do we get from this verse to Salim's conquest of Cairo, the fatedness of Salim's conquest of Cairo in Kamal Pashazade's reading? There are a number of operative words here I've outlined or highlighted in red and letters. This again is totally standard letters procedure, right? This is the Quran and therefore the model of the cosmos, right? We're talking about the analysis of the cosmos by the letters analysis of the Quran. So walaqad is equal to 140 in Arabic alphabet, of course, which is equal to Salim. Now, this doesn't seem a very modern concept, but anything that has numerical equivalence has ontological equivalence, right? We're talking about Neo-Pythagorean cosmology. So having the letters of your name add up to the same as a word in the Quran is a ontological statement. So Zabur equals Zamhirir in letterist analysis. Ba in Ba'd is 2, of course. And whenever you see Ba'd, it's a temporal signifier. That's always going to refer to a political prediction, right? And Dhikri would be 920, i.e. 1514, right? Battle of Chaldiran. Al-Ard, he gives a number of Quranic verses showing that Al-Ard in Quranic usage usually refers to Egypt and is associated with Pharaoh in particular. And finally, Ibadi, as you separate out, Ain, Badi. Ain, manifest, Zahir. So Uthman, Zahir in Cairo in after 920. So the whole verse, as Kamal Pashazzadeh then reads it, is as follows. Salim, we have written that 2 years after 920, or 1514, in the winter, so 922, the last month of 922, the righteous son of Uthman shall manifest and inherit Egypt. And so it happened. Right? He wrote this treatise, just to mention this again, about a month before Salim took Cairo. Right? So this seems like a sort of a crazy sort of marginal statements, which has certainly been treated as such in the literature. I'm arguing that this is absolutely central to Salim's self-fashioning as an Ottoman universal ruler. This actually does not begin in Cairo itself. It actually begins in Chaldiran, or relation to Chaldiran in Istanbul by occult scientists working at the the Ottoman court. So we have Ismail, who is, of course, the god king and reincarnation of Ali, coming head-to-head with Salim, who is not a god king, right? So how is Salim going to compete with Shah Ismail and his claims to divinity? Through occult science, first and foremost. Of course, this is the famous battle, the Fraskunchil Sultan Isfahan. You have Salim and you have Shah Ismail. Now, the problem here, the Ottomans win because they have better guns. Sorry, they have better guns, so they win. But they also have better magic. And this is the aspect that has not been explored properly in the literature. For example, a colleague of mine, Tunç Shen, we're writing an article on the use of the occult sciences in the run-up to Chaldiran as part of the military strategizing. Again, about 2 years before 1514, 1512, 1513, you have a number of geomancers and astrologers and lettrists at the Ottoman courts producing predictions like this, urging Salim to invade Iran. Right? So on this side, you have an astrological prediction or interpretation of the solar eclipse of again, 1513, I believe, 1514, basically saying this is the best time to attack Iran. So go now. You have about a 12-month window, a 13-month window. So now is the time to attack Iran. And on the left, you have a series of geomantic prognostications. Again, these are done about 2 years beforehand, and they say, Salim, you need to attack Iran now. And so he did, and he won. Idris Bedlisi, another very important Ottoman ideologue, also a lettrist. His name is fairly familiar, as is Kamal Pachazadeh's. He begins his career, however, in the Aqayunlu Chancery, right? And this is very, very important. He is also the student of Jalaluddin Davoni, a very prominent Aqayunlu philosopher, a philosopher whose work is extremely important for both Safavid and Ottoman intellectual history for centuries after. He's also a lettrist imperial ideologue to the Aqayunlu, which is, again, something that has not been explored in the literature. I'm writing a book on the subject now with Davoni as a main protagonist. He flees the impending Safavid takeover of Tabriz in 1502 and then takes up employment at the Ottoman courts. He wrote the Hash Behesht and a number of other works like the Salim Shahnameh, very important for, again, Ottoman imperial self-fashioning. This Hash Behesht was written well before the Ottoman conquest of Cairo, and he presented it to Bayezid II in 1506. Bedlisi himself lived in Cairo briefly in 1511 to 12, and after his residence in Cairo, he adds a section on Chalderan, which is explicitly lettrist. I can't get into the precedents for this, but my essential argument here is that he is modeling his lettrist arguments on those of Sharafuddin Yazdi's Zafarnameh, which constructs a similar dual astrological lettrist platform for Timur and Timurid ideology, Universalist ideology specifically. So Bedlisi first Aqayunluizes Timurid lettrist imperial ideology, and then he Ottomanizes it after the fact. And in particular, he is taking Davoni's argument that Bid' Sinin of the Surat al-Rum prophecy, which I'll get to in a second, does not refer to the Aqayunlu, to Uzun Hassan, but refers rather to Salim. So Bedlisi's, this is extract from his Salim Shahnameh. I just want to point out the fact that Bedlisi is very much about Salim's status as a messianic, eschatological ruler, right? He is the Mahdiya Akhir Zaman Sensen. He's everything. He's an Alexander. He's Solomonic of virtues. He's Jesus' breath. He's in character a prophet, an Adventist saint, an Alexander in military might, a Khizr inspiration, a Christ in healing, a Moses in speech. He's the refuge of all people of faith. He is the Mahdi, Lord of the age, or another reading has it, Mahdi of the end of time, Mahdi Akhir Zaman, as we saw. Incidentally, Lord of the age is obviously a Shia, category, Sahib Zaman. So the focus here on the Bid' Sinin, or the Surat al-Rum prophecy in general, has a long pedigree that, again, I don't have time to get into today, but suffice it to say it begins its fame with Ibn Barajan's prediction of Salah ad-Din's retaking of Jerusalem in 1187. So Salah ad-Din is a major point of reference here. But Bedlisi says, no, this absolutely refers to Salim in particular, not to Salah ad-Din, not to Timur, not to Uzun Hassan. This is one of the many manuscripts of the Hash Behesht. It's the major Persian language history of the Ottoman Empire, of the Ottoman dynasty rather. And I just want to draw your attention to the Surat al-Rum prophecy here in red with a green arrow. Alam ghurabat al-Rum min adl al-ard wa hum min ba'di ghalbihim sayaghlibun fi bid' sinin. Alif Lam Mim, Rome, obviously Ottomans in this case, were vanquished in the near part of the land, and after a few years, bid' sinin, they will vanquish. Right? So how do we interpret that to favor the Ottomans? Well, like this. Right? You can see the little, it's very fairly straightforward breakdown analysis, lettrist analysis there. Just inline numbers and all that jazz. I'll come back to Yazdi and his own teacher, Ibn Turka, if there's time in the Q&A, but suffice it to say, this is where he is getting his inspiration from. He worked in the Aqayunu Chancery, as I said, whose model and whose main competitor was the Timurid Chancery. So I'll get into this later, but this is how Yazdi describes Timur, right, Lord of Conjunction, Sahib Qiran, but also last emperor in history, Akhir Zaman. That is what Bidlisi is applying now to Salim, using, like Yazdi, letrist and astrological arguments. I should note here, I'll skip all this. This is another nice letrist analysis, as you would see it in a manuscript. Timurid. Davoni, just very briefly, and again we can come back to it, I just wanted to make the point that the Timurid ideological platform, imperial platform, is very distinctive. It's both astrological, Saham Quran, but also letrist. So the pairing of astrology and letrism is distinctively Timurid. So whenever you see this popping up in the Ottoman sources or the Aqayinu sources or Mughal sources, we're talking about a Timurid model. That's what Dawani says. The son of fortune of this Bahadur clan has been and continues to daily ascend the heights of prosperity, and the planet of its greatness daily climbs the ranks of majesty, such that the solar brilliance of its conquering ferocity and the radiant planet of its rule has entered the sign of exaltation, and the dawn of the event promised has broken forth from the eastern horizon of Bid'a Sinin in such a wise that no conscious person can have any doubt on the matter. Right? This is a clinching argument. Anybody who can be described by Bid'a Sinin is the foretold ruler of Islam. Mufti Ahmed Pash, my final case, and I think I have a few minutes left, also talks about the victory of Chaldiran after the fact and makes it a very potent part of his ideology in service of Salim. He's not a well-known guy. He's a sort of a provincial mufti. He's actually in Derna initially, and then in Bursa, where he dies in 1521. He sends Salim a tahniyatnameh, a letter of congratulation, immediately after the Battle of Chaldiran. Of course, he provides in this letter a letrist proof why this is a fated event. And he also connects his letrist proof with one of the earliest statements of Ottoman universal imperialism, or universalist imperialism. This is the tahniyatnameh. Again, a very heavily Persian, Ottoman Turkish. I'll skip all this. What do we have here? Bid'a Sinin, yet again, right? And just to focus on this final paragraph, the previous paragraph has a nice oneiromantic analysis, a dream analysis, where he says, I talked with all the scholars in heaven, and they said, obviously Salim is fated to win. But then he clinches his argument with the Bid'a Sinin. So I'll read it out. This mighty gift and great boon was best heralded by the speech of the glorious Lord of all worldlings, to wit, in the surah that opens as follows, Alif Lam Mim, etc. This is a testament most faithful to a divine intimation. For according to the prophetic statement that the Quran has an exterior and an interior, and its every internal layer has a further 7 layers more occult and best known by God. The nearer part of the land, Adna al-Arth, is here spoken of refers to the letter Dad, whose value is 800, and a few years, Bid'a Sinin, is reducible to the letters Sin Ya, Nun Ya, which together equal 120. That is, in the year 800 after the Hijrah, Persia will vanquish Byzantium, i.e. the Timurids will trounce the Ottomans at the Battle of Ankara in 1402. And after 20 years have passed, Byzantium will vanquish Persia, i.e. at the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514. Right? It works out fairly well. Thereby did the realizer of hopes, whose gift is glorious, grant a desire above all desires. This manifest conquest, which shall abide until the day of judgment as proof of the possibility of achieving universal conquests and realizing ambitions that are total. I want to really emphasize this last phrase. Here, Bufat Mobin ila Yom ad-Din, Fehrist Husula Futuhat Kulliyah, Imperial Universalism, Va Unvan Vusule Muradat Jumniyah, Ulub. Right. So this is again one of the earliest statements of Ottoman universalist imperialism, not just dynastic prestige. And it is explicitly pinned to bid'a sanin in a letrist context. So, as he concludes, may the observances of Islam and its law be hegemonic in perpetuity, the enemies of religion and state be crushed, the Safavids, the saviors of law and society triumph, the standards of law and religion roll forth until the day of resurrection, this by virtue of Nun and Sad. Not sure what that refers to. So this is the context in which I'm proposing that we reanalyze or get back into some of these sources that have been marginalized because of their occult scientific tenor. I'm arguing this is a big mistake, and we run the risk of fundamentally misconstruing Ottoman imperialism in its formative phase. Thank you.
Is this thing? No, okay. Let's see. Laser pointer. That works, right? Okay, good. Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I'm very happy to be paired up with Matthew and also to be speaking at the first panel of this conference because historians always like to start at the beginning, and I'm actually going to go all the way back to the 15th century BC. So, BC. Very briefly. Okay. In 1546, having recently arrived from Istanbul to begin an appointment as Qadi of Cairo, Salih Jalalzadeh, the younger brother of the Ottoman Grand Chancellor Mustafa Jalalzadeh, took a day off from work to see some local sights. His chosen destination was the Cairene suburb of Al-Matariya, an easily accessible spot with two noteworthy attractions. The first was the ancient city of Heliopolis, or Ain Shams. Here it is, where a massive temple complex to the sun god Re Artum had once stood. As is the case today, the only visible vestige of this complex in the 16th century was a single imposing obelisk. Just a short walk from there, Al-Matariya was also home to an ancient Christian holy site, a water source where, according to Coptic tradition, Mary and Jesus had once taken refuge. Take off my glasses. Here's the site today. Today, a sycamore tree stands at the site, believed by pilgrims to be descended from the original tree that shaded the Holy Family. But at the time of Jalalzadeh's visit, the place had even deeper significance as the source of balsam, a necessary ingredient of the holy myrin used for the anointment of priests and the sanctification of baptismal water. While balsam trees are today no longer cultivated in Al-Matariya, in the 1500s the Coptic Church still held that the holy myrin could only be made from balsam nourished by its holy waters. With so much to take in, Jalalzadeh's visit apparently left a deep impression on him. So much so that he eventually made it the subject of the most carefully constructed and personalized chapter in his Tarikh Misr al-Jadid, a monumental work on the history and the sacred geography of Egypt that he completed after his return to Istanbul in 1550. It's not the oldest known copy, but here's one copy. This is a text that has been largely ignored by modern scholarship. As far as I know, there's the only work on it is a Turkish master's thesis, which is basically a transcription of the first half, which unfortunately doesn't include the part that I'm going to discuss today. Nevertheless, it is a work of stunning complexity and originality that could easily be the subject of one or even many book-length studies. For the limited purposes of this talk, I would like to focus on Jalalzadeh's account of his visit to Al-Matariya as an example of one relatively undiscussed outcome of the Ottoman conquests of the Mamluk lands. That is, the ensuing intellectual engagement among Rumi scholars from the Ottoman metropole with the antiquity of Egypt, and particularly with the rich and sometimes disturbing visibility of Egypt's polytheistic past. In doing so, I would like to revisit and in some sense to complicate a commonly held view about the history of Ottoman expansion in the 16th century. Namely, that the Ottoman incorporation of the Arab lands inevitably led to the consolidation of a Sharia-minded and Sunni identity for the empire at the expense of various heterodox and millenarian intellectual traditions that had previously competed on relatively equal footing. Right? I think this is kind of one way in which my talk fits in perfectly with Matthew's. In existing literature, at least two important reasons are given for this view. First, the incorporation of the Arab provinces radically altered the demographic profile of the Ottoman state, whose population became, for the first time in its history, predominantly Sunni Muslim. Second, at the more rarefied level of intellectual exchange, the conquest initiated an intense encounter between the Ottoman ulema and their counterparts in the Arab world, bringing the Ottoman learned elites into direct contact with the long-established and prestigious centers of Sunni scholarship of the former Mamluk dominions. By the middle of the 16th century, or so the argument goes, the result was a general consensus that the Ottoman state was defined in an essential way by its role as the upholder of Sunni orthodoxy, a consensus based not only on a canonical understanding of the law itself, but also on a historical narrative that linked the sultans in a linear fashion back through the Seljuks, the Abbasids, the Umayyads, and the Rashidun. A familiar story. One element that is missing from this account, however, is that the conquest of the Arab lands also brought Rumi intellectuals into direct contact with a physical and textual landscape of dizzying antiquity. One, moreover, in which the region's polytheistic past remained visible in a way that was both unfamiliar and fundamentally disorienting. Rumi intellectuals were thus faced with the challenge of coming to terms with this pre-Islamic past and in some measure domesticating it, while at the same time claiming for themselves the region's rich Islamic heritage. As we shall see, these two projects were not as easily separated from one another as one might imagine. And the outcome, at least in the case of Jalalzadeh, was hardly a preordained highway to Sunni orthodoxy. Instead, his encounter with Egyptian antiquity produced a complex roadmap of intersecting historical footpaths, each leading back to previously unknown pasts and forward to previously uncontemplated futures. Before turning to the specifics of Jalalzadeh's text, it is worth emphasizing that he was but one of a large number of Rumi intellectuals who traveled to post-conquest Egypt and, similarly inspired by its antiquity, produced important works of scholarship. For another example, we need look no further than the frontispiece of our illustrious conference program. Here it is, which features a painting from the celebrated Bayana Manazil by Matrakche Nasuh. 2 decades before producing this sumptuously illustrated account of the Ottoman conquest of Iraq, for which I'm looking forward to seeing you all again in 20 years in Baghdad, celebrate the 500th anniversary. Anyway, 2 decades before producing this work, Matrakche was also one of the first Rumi men of letters to spend time in Ottoman Egypt, serving under the governorship of Hayr Beg, who died in 1522. Upon his return to Istanbul, Matrakche would spend much of the next decade working on the Mejma' at-Tawarikh, a work in some ways of even greater ambition than the Bayana Manazil. As Hussein Yurdaydin has shown in a careful biographical study of Matrakche, this work was at its heart a comprehensive Turkish translation of at-Tabari's Tarikh ar-Rusul wal-Muluk, a lengthy and supremely complex text that continues to elude full translation even by modern scholars. Matrakche's contribution, however, went far beyond one of simple translation, instead approximating what we might call a critical edition. He included, for instance, an introduction on cosmography and world geography based on Al-Biruni, another canonical authority previously untranslated into Turkish. And throughout his subsequent 4 volumes, he also updated and annotated Tabari's text and added coordinates, distances, corrections, and details based on his own personal experiences and through cross-referencing with other works. Finally, he provided a continuation of at-Tabari's chronicle from the author's death in the early 10th century to Matrakche's own day, although the final volume of this work is no longer preserved in a complete copy. Through the addition of this later material, Matrakche thus transformed a project of translation into one of appropriation, forging a direct narrative link between the Abbasid and pre-Abbasid past of his source and the Ottoman present of Suleimanic Istanbul. Even so, it would be a mistake to think that the outcome of his labors was a totalizing narrative of triumphant Sunni orthodoxy. Instead, because al-Tabari had lived quite early in Abbasid history and had himself engaged in a very similar project of placing the history of the Abbasids within a much longer narrative of classical, biblical, and pharaonic antiquity, the result is a work with an unexpected chronological focus on the pre-Islamic past. Of the 4 volumes that constitute Matrakch's final text, of which the 4th he wrote later, the first, which is close to 500 folios long, ends with the reign of the prophet Solomon. The second, of similar length, ends with the reign of the Sasanian emperor Nushirvan. In other words, Matrakcha presents his readers with a universal history focused primarily on the world before the arrival of Islam, populated by the figures of biblical antiquity, but also by a panoply of godless kings and pagan peoples. There was, of course, nothing particularly novel about this from the perspective of Arab historiography, but it was new for Ottoman historiography. To be sure, Ottoman literati had long been familiar with the highly mythologized version of the pre-Islamic past as it appeared in the Persian epics, later appropriated in an Ottoman form in Ahmadi's Iskendername. But to my knowledge, never before had something approaching a documentary history of the pre-Islamic world been presented in Ottoman Turkish, at least not in anything approaching the detail of Matrakch's Mijma' at-Tawarikh. Okay, so with this in mind, let us now turn to Jalalzadeh, who certainly knew of Matrakch's text, although it is uncertain the degree to which he consulted it directly. By comparison, his new history of Egypt casts a much wider net in its search for sources, relying on more recent authors like al-Makrizi and al-Suyudi, in addition to at-Tabari and early authorities. But what most distinguishes the new history of Egypt is that it is focused overwhelmingly on the ancient past and Jalalzadeh's own personal encounter with the ancient past, with only cursory attention paid to the intervening stratum of Islamic history. To this end, the text avoids the teleological unifying narrative structure of a work like Matrakch's, and instead, it is roughly divided into 2 parts. The first half recounting the history of Egypt down to the Abbasid period, while the second half is much more reminiscent of a travel narrative, with individual chapters devoted to the most important natural and monumental sites of the country. Quite unusually, most of these are sites that have either been buried by the sands of time or by the physical sands of the desert, such that they are only accessible through texts. But this is not always the case, and when possible, Jalalzadeh tries to cross-reference consulted works with his own eyewitness testimony. His account of Ain al-Shams, which we now turn to, has been chosen in part because it is one of the places where he is able to do this most systematically. In describing the site, Jalalzadeh begins with a description of its famous obelisk and what is known of it from ancient authorities. He writes, here I am quoting, "Near the town called Al-Matariya, one can see the remains of a city known as Ain al-Shams, where there is a marvelous and majestic obelisk of the tallest and hardest stone. It is square at the base and tapers to a point at the top. Once upon a time, there was a temple to the sun built here, of which this obelisk is all that remains. At that time, this place was understood to be a great sanctuary, and believers in its right came here as pilgrims from all the corners of the world. Besides this one, there were other temples as well, in various places, which they visited. They built these according to the forms of the 7 planets and worshipped the stars there. The first to build such a place was Seth, the son of the prophet Adam, and after him Enoch, who was the first to learn the science of astrology. There was one people called the Sabaeans who kept 12 temples here where they would pray, each one consecrated to one sign of the zodiac with its own unique form. And in those 12 temples, 12 nations prayed and worshipped, saying that they worshipped the stars so that they might intercede on their behalf with God as spirits or angels, and grant kindnesses and favors that they asked of them. And they would also say, we approach these images in order to approach the angels, and thanks to their proximity, we can come closer to God, something that without them we could not do. These people maintained that the prophets alone are not enough, reasoning that no man can serve as intermediary between other men and God. So they worshiped the 7 planets, every day praying to a different one. To him they would pray 3 times a day, that is to say, at dawn, at noon, and at dusk. So this is the introductory section, which essentially constitutes an apology of pagan worship, pagan star worship, and it's followed by several pages of sometimes conflicting accounts about what the original temple looked like, the various wonders and miracles associated with it, and so forth. From here, Jalalzadeh then turns to Mary's Well and includes a similar collection of stories from available texts, this time apparently also drawing from an apocryphal gospel in Arabic. He then begins to describe his own visit to this site, paying particularly close attention to the balsam trees, which he describes in a manner that follows a notably parallel structure to his introductory section about the obelisk. Quoting again, "Some say that this plant grows in no other part of the world, since it won't yield its essence with any other water source, and it is for this reason that it is so rare and so valued throughout the world. All Christians hold the oil from this balsam in the greatest esteem, considering it the remedy for any illness. The kings of Ethiopia and Greece and Italy used to send ambassadors with sumptuous gifts to the sultans of Egypt in exchange for this balsam, which they considered of higher value than anything else. And it is well known that the Christians have a special water which they use for baptism, and they believe that if a Christian is not blessed with this water, he is not fully a Christian. And if this water does not contain a trace of balsam, it is imperfect." Jalalzadeh then confirms the essentials of this account through his own eyewitness testimony. In an extended passage covering several folios, he describes his own visit to the balsam orchard, where he speaks with the farmer responsible for tending the trees, observes the process of harvesting the sap, breaks off a twig of one of the trees to smell its fragrant oils, and drinks from the sacred water source that nourishes them. In so doing, his account establishes a relatively transparent genealogical progression between Ain Shams, the sacred site of pagan antiquity, which, as a dead tradition, is now only visible through the half-buried stone, and then the Christian stratum of Al-Matariya, a living tradition with a vibrance still palpable in the fragrant branches of the balsam springing from the waters originally touched by the Virgin Mary. Finally, in a surprise closing move, Jalalzadeh once again uses his own testimony to close the circle and establish a connection between the earlier levels of history in this sacred place and the final stratum of empire and faith that he himself represents, Ottoman Islam. Turning away from Al-Matariya and back to the obelisk, he remarks, "This obelisk is remarkably similar to the one in Istanbul that stands in the At Meydana on 4 bronze feet. In fact, the two appear to be of the same stone, and it would be nothing to marvel at if we were to say that the same master carved them both. Each are also decorated with symbols, some in the form of cattle, others of birds, and each figure is carved in exactly the same manner in relief from the rock. And in each case, symbols appear on all 4 sides in the same fashion, although in our times, there is no longer anyone who knows how to read what they say. But one difference between the two is that the base of the obelisk in Istanbul is visible, while this one is covered beneath the earth, and it appears that over time it is sinking, since it no longer has the great stature and height of which the ancient authors speak. There are cracks near the base of the east side, and it is leaning towards the west, such that soon enough it seems certain to fall." End quote. Thus, the towering obelisk at Ain Shams, the last visible sign of the greatest temple of a vanished ancient religion, is identical in all of its particulars to the obelisk standing at the At Meydana, or the Hippodrome, in Istanbul, the ceremonial heart of the new sacred empire for which Jalalzadeh himself is the representative. Except, while the obelisk in its original home is half buried in the sand and seemingly on the verge of collapse, the one transplanted to its new home in Istanbul stands tall and strong on a platform of bronze. Uncannily, the powerful symbolism invoked by Jalalzadeh matches almost exactly the real history of the obelisk of Theodosius in Istanbul's At Meydanı. Originally, this obelisk is known to have been one of a pair removed from the temple of Karnak in the 4th century of the Common Era as part of the project, then ongoing, of creating a new Rome in Constantinople, the Roman Empire's new capital. Under Constantius II, the son of Constantine and the first Christian emperor of Rome, both obelisks were transported from Karnak to Alexandria, and from there one was brought to Rome, and here it was erected in the Circus Maximus next to yet another obelisk that had been set up by Emperor Augustus on the occasion of his original conquest of Egypt in the 1st century. Meanwhile, the second of the two obelisks was destined for Constantinople's Hippodrome, a ceremonial space self-consciously designed as the new capital's direct equivalent of the Circus Maximus. So Augustus conquers Egypt and brings an obelisk and sets it up in the Circus Maximus. Constantius, the first Christian emperor, brings another one and sets it up next to the first one, and then is sending one to Constantinople for the equivalent of the Circus Maximus in Constantinople. Constantius died before finalizing this project, but it was later brought to term by the Emperor Theodosius I in the year 390. This is why we call this the obelisk of Theodosius. Thereafter, in the upheavals that ended Roman rule in the West, the obelisks in the Circus Maximus were knocked down. But the one in the Hippodrome still stood 1,000 years later, when the Ottomans conquered Constantinople and made it their capital. By that time, the obelisk had overseen a 3-millennium history of translatio imperii and translatio fidei, from Egyptian star worship to Roman paganism to Byzantine Christianity, and finally to Ottoman Islam. Today, we are able to reconstruct this story thanks to the painstaking work of Renaissance humanists, who by the 16th century had already established the history of Istanbul's obelisk and the ideological motivations behind its voyage from Egypt. But how much of this story could have been known to Celalzadeh? And to what extent is it reasonable to suppose that he developed his own account of Ain Shams in reference to it? While the full answer to this question must remain the subject of another paper, for now, let us note that the base of the obelisk, to which Celalzadeh himself had referred in the passage that I just read to you, featured a carved block of marble commemorating its raising by the Emperor Theodosius. One face of this block, showing a group of vanquished barbarians in submission to the emperor and his entourage, here's the emperor, these are the vanquished barbarians, features a Latin inscription in which the obelisk itself, speaking in the first person, declares its own submission to the emperor. It reads, "Though formerly I opposed resistance, I was ordered to obey the serene masters and to carry their palm once the tyrants had been overcome. All things yield to Theodosius and to his everlasting descendants. This is true of me too. I was mastered and overcome in 3 times 10 days and raised towards the upper air." Is it far-fetched to suppose that Celalzadeh knew the meaning of this inscription? If his writing in the New History of Egypt is any indication, he went to great pains throughout his travels to learn the meaning of writing on all the monuments that he encountered, including those in languages at least as obscure as Latin, including Coptic, Greek, and Hebrew. Moreover, in his younger days, Celalzadeh is known to have been a client of the Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, who built a grandiose palace, today the Museum of Turkish and Islamic Art, immediately facing the obelisk in the Hippodrome. So here is the palace of Ibrahim Pasha, and here is the obelisk. As Ebru Turan has recently argued, Ibrahim intentionally chose to build his palace here, in the ceremonial heart of late antique Constantinople that later fell into disuse, in order to showcase his project of restoring Istanbul to its rightful place as the new Rome. Then, from this celestial capital, Ibrahim's sovereign Suleiman the Magnificent would rise to the heights of millennial rulership, founding a universal empire in which the various peoples and faiths of the world would live together in perpetual concord. Ibrahim is known to have had at least 2 close collaborators in this project. The first was Alvise Gritti, the bastard son of the Venetian Doge Andrea Gritti, whose private residence in Pera became something of an Italian humanist court in miniature, frequented by figures such as Tranquillo Andronico and Francesco della Valle. Exactly the kind of people who might have told Jalalzadeh about the symbolic history of the obelisk of Theodosius, and who also could have translated this Latin inscription for him. Meanwhile, Ibrahim's second close collaborator was, of course, Mustafa Jalalzadeh, the Ottoman Grand Chancellor and the older brother of Salih Jalalzadeh, who was known to have himself traveled to Egypt with Ibrahim Pasha at the very beginning of his Grand Vizierate. Jalalzadeh then composed the Qanun-Name-i Misr, in whose introduction he advanced a claim of universal sovereignty for the House of Osman, based on Sultan Selim's conquest of Egypt. This grand project of Messianic universalism is typically thought to have died along with Ibrahim Pasha in 1536, and to be replaced by the Sharia-minded image of Suleiman the Magnificent's later years as the lawgiver. But Jalalzadeh's account of Ain Shams suggests a different possible end to the Grand Vizier's story. Rather than dying with him, Ibrahim Pasha's messianic vision may have received its fullest intellectual articulation many years after his death and from a most unexpected source: the pen of a high-ranking jurist brought to the valley of the Nile and confronted with the unfathomable antiquity of Egypt and its many gods. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take questions for around 20 minutes, 25 minutes or so, and then have a coffee break. So the floor is open if there's any questions.
Thank you so much for both papers. I have a quick question to Matthew, and also a sort of open-ended question to Giancarlo. Matthew, I'm curious about the Kemal Paşazade treatise. Did you entertain the possibility that it might be ascribed to him but not belong to him? Because you also mentioned it doesn't come up in the tafsir, it only comes up as an independent treatise. Is that treatise sort of written in collections together with other Kemal Paşazade treatises? Is that how it exists, or does it exist separately? Is there a way of dating it, or sort of thinking about the possibility that it might belong to somebody else but have been ascribed to him? Because I wondered why he would not have such a sort of interpretation in the tafsir if it is a successful interpretation that actually it foresaw the conquest of Egypt. I would have imagined that he would be proud to have included that in the tafsir, but you mentioned that it is not. So if you could just address that possibility, or the sort of the details of the manuscript, etc., that would be great. And Giancarlo, I wanted to ask you just about I know that you are in the early stages of this research project, so it might be too early to answer this, but did you think about the reception of this text, these particular parts of the text? Does it come up in later histories, chronicles, world histories, etc.? And if it does, in what context? Thank you so much.
As far as, can you hear me? As far as I can tell, or as far as Dr. Kilic showed, he discusses this problem, so I didn't really get into it myself. It's preserved as a unicum in Konya. It's, again, sort of a one-off, and he analyzes it as such. My basic point is, I was more intellectual context for why this shouldn't be considered a one-off and perhaps even pseudepigraphal. This is just what everybody was doing in the early 15th century. So it's no longer seems out of character for somebody like Kemal Paşazade to write this thing, even though he doesn't incorporate it as tafsir, which is what finished 20 years later, near his death, he has an interpretation of Surah Al-Anbiya, but it's not that interpretation. I'm not sure why. Certainly, I mean, who knows? It's something to do with the atmosphere at the Ottoman court in the 1530s, rather than maybe with Ibrahim Pasha or something like that. Who knows why he might have taken it out or just not included it. Again, my basic point is that Kemal Pasha Zade, like other prominent Ottoman intellectuals, he's very well aware of Bistamian or Ikhwan al-Safa type of letrist analyses, and he's very aware that he is tapping into a joint Timurid Aqaylu Mamluk Ottoman tradition. So he's basically doing ideological warfare on the ground, as well as just pushing his patron to conquer Cairo.
So before I answer your question, Baki, I also just wanted to mention that Kemal Pasha Zadeh was the Hoja of Salih Jalalzadeh as well. So there's a nice kind of closing of the circle in that respect too. It's a wonderful question. I don't have a good answer for you yet. The sort of next thing that I was going to do after I get back from Beirut is there's an important work on the history and the monuments of Istanbul that is written in the 1560s. It's a kind of version of some earlier similar works that Stefan Gerasimos wrote about a bit, but I'm going to go there and sort of look to see if there's anything that I can come up with in terms of a reflection of this. However, I will also say that I do have the impression that during the second half of the 16th century, there is a kind of a consolidated effort to think about the past in a different way. Is this not working? There's a consolidated effort to think about the past in a way that is different from the early 16th century, and some of the critical pieces are removed. So so here, this is from the 1580s, and there are lots of paintings from the 1580s there are many such paintings from the 1580s of the At Meydana, and they all show extremely carefully the hieroglyphs on the obelisk itself, but they always leave the base blank. And that's the most important part if you want to be able to make the connection between the history of that particular obelisk and what Jalalzadeh is talking about. You need to know that Roman connection, which is not there. So I do have the impression that in the late 16th century, people are interested in de-emphasizing that part of the story. They want to create a kind of a different narrative itinerary. So it's a challenge for me to be able to reconstruct this.
Any more questions, please?
Thank you very much for both speakers. I have the one question to the Michael and also the Giancarlo. You talked about this, the Eastern, the scholars mostly from the Timurid and the Iranian the world, but there is also, you mentioned Cairene-based, the occultist or ulum qariba scholars. Have you seen any reinterpretation or reworkings of Ahmed al-Buni's the works, who was a teacher of Makrizi, was an also very significant the figure in the ulum al-qariba, the field. And second of all, there is also a Syrian scholar, and I don't know exactly the origins, the Sheikh Ahmed Mekki al-Janib al-Gharbi, which was, the written around this time, the talking about the Selim's, the accomplishment. And I wonder, have you encountered any reworkings of the Ahmed al-Bunis in the Ottoman context? For the Giancarlo, again, Tarikh Misr Jadid of the Jalalzadeh, you mentioned the Makrizi, have you compared, how much he owes to the Makrizi, he uses his sources in that regard. Thank you.
I guess I'll begin with Makrizi. Makrizi is actually a major occultist as well. He's the only defender of Ibn Khaldun, as we know, who is a major anti-occultist of the late 14th century Cairene context. Ibn Khaldun, excuse me, I've written an article on this as well. I do not like Ibn Khaldun. He is a terrible, terrible person, mainly because he suppresses all of this occult scientific context, but it's, methinks he doth protest, too much. He spends 11% of the Muqaddimah, on an anti-occultist polemic. 11% of the greatest work of history, ever written, as if. So essentially, we have a situation in which Ibn Khaldun represents not the index for the marginalization of the occult sciences in late Mamluk Cairo, but rather the explosion of interest in the occult sciences, which Ibn Khaldun, famously conservative, stick in the mud, is trying to combat and outlaw by state fiat. Makrizi, he's his only supporter, is also part of the problem, right? He is well known to be an enthusiast of geomancy and lettrism and so on and so forth. As for Buni, so why Cairo, right? Why is Cairo the occult scientific capital of the 14th century Islamic world? Buni and Ibn Arabi together. These represent the two streams of lettrism, both theoretical and practical. And Buni, I didn't actually explain this due to time constraints, but essentially it is in Mamluk Cairo specifically and nowhere else that Maghribi, Ibn Arabi, Buni lettrism is sanctified, i.e. Sufisized, if you will, and then de-esotericized. And by, so terminology-wise, occult simply is an epistemological category. Esotericist, as I use it, or esoteric, is a sociological category, right? So occult sciences are absolutely mainstream in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. They're not esoteric in any way, shape, or form. Everybody is reading them in textual form. Manuscripts are circulating among elites and so on. It is in Cairo that Bunian lettrism specifically takes off among the ruling elite, again, right after the Black Death. It's apocalypse. Half of Cairo dies, right, in mid-14th century, and then suddenly the ruling elite are obsessed with Bunian letter magic. Why? Well, to regain control of a chaotic political and natural environment. My hypothesis. But this has been shown by Noah Gardner that Bunian, the explosion of interest in Bunian lettrism specifically is well paired with Ibn Arabian lettrism to serve as the basis for all the things that I just talked about. The New Brethren of Purity are big promoters of Ibn Arabi and Buni in equal measure. Abdurrahman Bastami himself sees himself almost as a second Buni. He is, a comprehensive lettrist. So essentially, the Cairo matters. You can never get away from Cairo. Even in the 17th century, in Safavid Iran, of all places, the Bunian legacy is still pinned to Cairo. So Safavid occult philosophers are still claiming their genealogy, intellectual genealogy, to late 14th century Mamluk Cairo in Safavid Iran. Yeah.
So Al-Makrizi is the most important source that Jalalzadeh uses, and in fact the first copy of this text that I ever came across was when I was in Suleimania as a PhD student. I was interested in translations, and it was cataloged as a translation of Al-Makrizi, which I think is one of the reasons why it hasn't really been studied very much, because there's a sort of an attitude that if something is a translation, it's not an original work, which is certainly very far from the case. So again, it's very long, and one of the problems is that Al-Makrizi often also will cite lots of different earlier authorities, so it's hard to tell sometimes when he's citing the other authorities he's checked for himself and when he's just citing Al-Makrizi. But what is clear is that he wants to go check by going to these places himself. So that's why I chose this passage, because you can see it very clearly. He has these accounts, and then he wants to go and see for himself, and then make something new out of it, which is, he actually begins the work in a very introspective personal account of how he came to Egypt, how he was a a professor in Bayezid Medresesi. He was happy, and then he had to go to Egypt, and he was so depressed. And then on the road, he was looking at the ruins and thinking, such is the transitory nature of happiness. One day, you're a great leader, then there's nothing but a ruin, just like one day you're a professor, then you have to go be a judge in Egypt. And then he stands before the pyramids, and he's so amazed by their antiquity that he then changes his attitude, and he decides that he needs to learn more about the past of this place. So that's kind of, and then he says, and then I found this book by al-Maqrizi. So that's sort of how he sets up the whole project.
Thank you. Please forgive my naive curiosity. I am not a historian, but I wish to learn how was that relation between the rulers and the esoteric people? Was that professional? How do they ask the people to have comments, advices? How was that paid? And do we know some also not success comments? Please do not touch the issue of Vienna. Do not go there. How was that?
What was the last point? Warnings against conquering Vienna in this literature? Yeah, I don't, I mean, again, I'm not an Ottomanist, so I can only bring sort of Timurid or Aqayunlu or Safavid or Mughal examples, but in terms of the court patronage of these occult scientists, it's heavy. Obviously, the Ottoman court institutes the Munajjambashi, office, which remains till the 20th century, right? This is a well-paid position and so on. I need to emphasize that if you do not do your job and predict the future, you lose your job, right? These are experimental sciences, or lose your head, exactly. These are experimental sciences, they're falsifiable, right? These are natural mathematical sciences, they're not mysticism. For all the Sufisization of letterism in particular, because of Buni and Mamluk Cairo, they remain part of the mathematical natural sciences, and as you saw in these documents, they're perfectly mainstream as parts of applied astronomy, right? In particular, geomancy is also part of applied astronomy. So they're patronized by through the patronization of, for example, the observatory in Istanbul. It didn't last very long, but this is how you pay your occult scientists. But you can get paid very directly. You have all sorts of registers. Not many survive from my period, but these people are well remunerated whenever they predict the future correctly, right? So there's an incentive to be a good occult scientist. I don't know, again, the salary levels, certainly. In terms of rulers actually practicing the occult sciences themselves, this becomes most evident, I think, in the Timurid context first. Again, I peg everything in the Timurid context. Not Timur himself, who never claimed even to be, a king. He was always, good again, right? The son-in-law to Chinggis Khan, descendant. But his grandson, Iskandar Sultan, he only ruled for about 5 years, but he performed what I call occult philosopher kingship. He's the first post-Mongol ruler to expressly perform occult philosopher kingship by being himself a very competent occult scientist as the basis for his claim to Timurid, the Timurid throne, essentially. He lost that claim, but his claim was very, very influential. A second ruler of the Timurid line to do the same is Ulugh Beg, right? The famous builder of the Samarkand Observatory, the foremost scientific institution of the Western world in the 15th century period. Ulugh Beg has always been approached by historians of science as, in a very positivist manner, they've completely elided the occult scientific context to his, mathematization of astronomy, for example, which is the direct precedent for Copernicus, we should remember. But the people working at the Samarkand Observatory are also occultists. Ulugh Beg is called a Sultan of Felasuf by his people like Qazizadeh Rumi, coming from the Ottoman domains. Qazizadeh Rumi is part of the Brethren of Purity network that I just talked about, very explicitly so. So he's interested in lettrism and astrology and geomancy as the application of the measurements that are being taken at the Samarkand Observatory. So you don't often get sultans performing occult science or being practicing occult scientists until Salah ad-Din, for example, was very interested in alchemy, but he only hired that out. Right? He only hired alchemists. With the Timurids, you actually have sultans becoming occult scientists in their own right, and this is the basis for Mughal imperialism, which is Indo-Timurid as well. Akbar performs solar kingship by becoming the planets successfully in each day of the week. Right? He takes it even a step further, I think, as a good Timurid, and becomes the sun. So in a way, that's also performing occult science, but again, it's not. This is how he becomes divine. Sorry. Hopefully that's clear.
Okay, I think we have time for one more quick question, and then we'll break for coffee.
Okay, this is more a comment than a question for Giancarlo. Of course, I was very interested from what you referred to. I presume many of these are unpublished sources. The number of Ottomans who come to Egypt following the conquest, of course, it reminds me of the number of Americans going to Iraq following the conquest. Right. But it sounds like a very rich period. And from what you said of Galalzadeh, it seems to me like this is a combination of history and travel literature. That's my impression. Is that new in Ottoman history writing? Maybe you can tell us. The final thought that comes to my head is this is a very sterile period in Egypt. Historians are no longer there for quite a long while. But that, of course, makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very useful to think about it in terms of a comparative imperial context. That is what's going on. There's this invasion of intellectuals that are coming on the heels of an invasion of armies, and one of the things that they do is they sort of systematically are trying to appropriate the past of this place. And I think that one of the limitations of Ottoman intellectual history as it exists now is that people just kind of assume a kind of continuity with the previous Arab Middle Eastern intellectual traditions, and they assume that people in the Ottoman Empire already knew everything that somebody who was an alim in the Arab world knew, let's say in the year 1600. But it's not the case. There was very superficial familiarity with the intellectual world, world of the Arab lands. And it's after the conquest that all of this is sort of discovered and systematically translated and appropriated, and it's an imperial project, definitely.
Okay, please join me in thanking our speakers, and we'll have a short coffee break and then back here.